Tulsi Gabbard is the first female combat veteran to run for president and one of the first elected to Congress. She's a major in the Army National Guard. She has served 16 years and deployed twice to the Middle East. Tulsi has served on the Homeland Security, Foreign Affairs, and Armed Services Committees, in addition to serving as vice chair of the DNC. She's running to bring a soldier's heart to the White House. Everyone, please welcome Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it. Can we give Brian and his wife Courtney a round of applause, please? Thanks so much for hosting us. It's so good to see all of you here. How are you tonight? It's a good day. It's not raining anymore, so that's a good thing. We came from the steak fry just a little bit before this, and you know, there were little off and on showers through most of the day, enough to keep us cool. When I got up to speak, I talked about how these little showers remind me of home. In Hawaii, you get the showers, then the sun comes out, and it's considered blessings in Native Hawaiian culture. And then the blessing tap turned on really hard there at the end. And it came pouring down, so it's good. We got a quick wet clothes change and came straight here, but I'm so glad that you all took the time to come here tonight. It's great to be here in Iowa, always. And there's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot for us to talk about, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that we're gonna have. I wanna kick it off though, just starting with really why we're all gathered here. Why we've taken our time off of a Saturday afternoon to come and talk about our future. Because it is our future that's at stake here on so many levels. Really what it comes down to when we look at the heart of the problems that we are seeking to solve is the reality that the vision that Abraham Lincoln laid out for us of a government of, by, and for the people is not the reality that we live with today. Instead, we have a government of, by, and for the very few, the very rich, and the very powerful. And they spent a lot of time getting this power. And all this time, it has been to the detriment of the people. We, the people, have been left behind as a result. I'm running for president because you deserve a president who will put your interests ahead of profits, put your interests ahead of partisan politics, who will put your interests and the interests of our country at the forefront of every single decision that's made. I will bring these values of service above self, these principles of integrity and respect and honor to the presidency to make sure that our White House is a beacon of light and hope and opportunity for every single American across this country. It is our future that is at stake. And we're gathered here because we understand that the only way that we bring about this government of, by, and for the people is when we, the people, make it happen, right? Making sure that our voices are heard. We, the people. We, the people. You know, these are words that we hear throughout our lives, but for too long, our voices have not been heard. And we see the results of this in so many different examples. Things that we're concerned about in everyday lives, things like healthcare. Now, the more we've had the opportunity to travel across the country, the more heartbreaking stories I hear from people about how our broken healthcare system isn't serving the healthcare needs of our people. How even as we see big health insurance companies and big pharmaceutical companies' profits continue to skyrocket and increase, more and more we are seeing Americans who are struggling just to get the basic care they need, who are struggling just to be able to afford necessary medicines or prescription drugs for themselves, for their children, for their parents, for their loved ones. We see more and more of our seniors who are struggling just to keep a roof over their heads and to be able to afford the medicines they need. Now, our government is the #1 buyer of prescription drugs in the world. The #1 customer in the world. So for any of us, who've ever been through an economics 101 class, or you understand the basics of business, you understand your biggest customer, there's some leverage there. And if they want to negotiate a lower price, odds are that you're going to be able to work with them to do that, because you want to keep your #1 customer, right? This was such a threat to the profits of big pharma that year after year after year, anytime health care reform comes up, they get their lobbyists right in there as quickly as they can to make sure that the prohibition for Medicare to negotiate lower drug prices for the American people is kept in law. Because God forbid that our laws and policies would actually serve the people instead of big pharma's profits. And they have succeeded thus far in keeping that status quo that serves them and causes harm to people. How is that possible? Because we have a government of, by, and for the rich and powerful, leaving the people behind. There are very real practical consequences to this. These aren't just empty words we're throwing out. This comes from the very few rich and powerful being able to use that power and that money to levy influence over policymakers who unfortunately are more interested in serving their interests than in the interests of the people. The opioid crisis is something that more and more people in our country unfortunately are falling victim to, and is more and more being brought into the center of conversations and then in the news, understanding that this is an epidemic that affects all of us. In my home state of Hawaii, it's a pretty small state. We have about 1.3 million people. Yet we have over 500,000 active opioid prescriptions. It's a lot. Almost half of our state. And there are other states that are worse off. Now, if you look at a lot of the corruption charges and the criminal charges that many states are now filing against these prescription drug companies like Purdue Pharma. Purdue Pharma now trying to park their assets in places outside of their company so that they can keep their money, and now most recently filing bankruptcy to once again protect themselves from we the people using our judicial system to serve us. But here's the thing is years ago, the DEA was starting to investigate the practices of big companies like Purdue Pharma and how they're cheating and lying to people and proliferating their drugs that are really ruining people's lives and in some cases taking their lives. Just as the DEA was closing in on this, and there's some documentaries that go into great detail on this, but just as the DEA was closing in, guess what happened in Congress? Congressman who was in a committee of power and jurisdiction was able to pass a law that basically took away the DEA's power to go after big pharma. So even as these guys were getting closer and closer in their case, all of a sudden they brought it to their boss. They said, sorry, we got no power. We can't do anything with this. A government of, by, and for the rich and powerful is not a government of, by, and for the people. This is the problem. This is the root cause of all of these challenges that we're facing. And this is the change that we're seeking to bring about. Whereas president, I'll fight for a healthcare system that serves every single American, making sure that everyone is able to get the care they need when they need it. We cannot be the wealthiest country in the world, paying far more for health care than any other country in the world, with worse outcomes, and more people in our country afraid of that one health care emergency that's going to break the bank and potentially put their family out on the street. As president, I'll fight to crack down on big insurance and big pharma, who've been profiting off of and exploiting the sick for far too long, making sure that we change our law so that we can negotiate lower prescription drug prices. We make sure that we're delivering that quality health care for all. As president, I'll crack down on big pharmaceutical companies who are behind this opioid epidemic, ending the federal prohibition on marijuana that they are fighting against because they know that in states where marijuana has been legalized or decriminalized, medicinal or recreational, otherwise, there's been a drastic reduction in opioid addiction and opioid-related deaths. We'll crack down on private prisons. We shouldn't have them. A business model that earns more profits for private prisons based on keeping their cells and their beds full, further incentivizing high recidivism rates than actually saying, hey, look, let's look at how we stop being the most incarcerated country in the world. Let's fix this problem by ending the failed war on drugs, by starting to treat substance abuse and addiction as a health care need, actually getting people the help that they need, rather than turning them into criminals. This is one of the ironic things. This is one of the ironic things that has been in place since this war on drugs began, right? Because the whole promise was, look, these drugs are very harmful. They're very bad for you. So let's make them illegal, scheduled in this controlled substances list. And if you're caught with them for possession or otherwise, we're going to throw you in prison because they're bad for you and we don't want you to get hurt. We want what's best for you. We don't want you to take these harmful drugs. So if you do, we'll throw you in prison and give you a criminal record for the rest of your life, which has disproportionately impacted communities of poverty and communities of color. Ending the failed war on drugs, dealing with the root cause of these problems. You look at our criminal justice system and how many people go in and out of this criminal justice system through this revolving door because they have mental health needs that are never really addressed, that are never identified, where you have someone who clearly needs help, but maybe they're, creating a nuisance. Get arrested for creating a nuisance on the sidewalk or on the streets, but this person really actually just needs help. They don't need to go spend the night in jail. They don't need to be arrested and go to prison. Getting to the root cause of these challenges and recognizing how we can and should provide this help for those who need it, and reserve our criminal justice system for those who actually do need to be in prison for the safety of our society. These are the kinds of changes that we can bring about when we actually are looking at what is in the best interest of the people. Not thinking about profits or partisan politics, just finding solutions. In Congress, a few months ago, we passed a bill called the First Step Act that dealt with some very important prison reforms that were long overdue. Prison reforms that, since this bill was passed and signed into law with strong bipartisan support, thousands of people who were previously in prison are now back home with their families because that's where they needed to be. Prison reforms that were put in place to help reduce these recidivism rates, that as people are there and they're serving their time for the crime that they committed, we're actually helping them be best set up for success to reintegrate back with their families and communities, rather than continue this cycle that we too often see, where someone gets out and there's no opportunity for them to move forward. This bill was not passed easily. The two leads on this bill was a very progressive guy who's from New York, good friend of mine, Hakeem Jeffries, and a very conservative guy who's a friend of mine who's a Republican from Georgia. Two people who come from very different backgrounds, different parties, completely different political ideologies, but they recognized this was an important thing that we need to do for the American people. They set aside their differences and they led the way. And both of them got criticized by leaders in their respective parties, saying, how dare you work with this guy? How dare you work with that guy? Don't you know how bad he is and how evil he is and how much he hates people? Both sides were saying that. But they put these principles of service above self on this bill and built a strong coalition within Congress, but also outside of Congress, getting partnerships from groups like the ACLU and the Koch brothers. Exactly. And a lot, brother, yes. Well, this was prior to. Prior to, thank you. Thank you. But because of this coalition, this bill was passed into law. You had Jared Kushner working very closely with my friend Van Jones, who was drummed out of the White House under the Obama administration by Republicans who accused him of being a communist. Working together to pass legislation that will actually help people. It was called the First Step Act because it's the first step. There's a lot more that we need to do in dealing with sentencing reform, dealing with prosecutor training and reform. There's a lot of work that we need to do, but this is a glimmer of hope when I'm often asked, like, how can we come together as a country? The divides seem so great. They almost seem too great to heal, too great to build bridges. But this is one example of many that we can point to that show what is possible when we come together as Americans. When we come together motivated by love and care for our country and for our people, that we recognize even if there's just one thing that we can agree on, there's probably more, but even if there's just one thing we can agree on, yes, as members of Congress, but us as people in this diverse nation, let's start the conversation there on a foundation of respect for each other. Not just talking at each other, but actually listening and having a discussion, having a debate, even having strong debate, and recognize this is not a bad thing. We can agree to disagree without being disagreeable on some things, find those areas of agreement, and move forward. Move forward, because that's really what we're looking to do here. For us to move forward so that every single election cycle, we don't have to keep talking about the same old things because they've never been solved. Because the responses... The responses are always a reaction to the superficial problem, never actually solving it, just putting a Band-Aid on it until the next thing pops up in the news or on Twitter, not actually getting to the root cause of the problem. So there's a lot of change that we need to make. We've got to address the threats we are facing to our environment, our climate. For those in the back of the room. Protection of our environment. This was something that for me, growing up in Hawaii, was not something that I had to be taught. I'm grateful for that. I grew up, when I first learned how to swim, it was in the shallow end of the ocean. With sand everywhere. But I grew up with a culture of respect and understanding of responsibility that we have as people to protect our home, to protect our water, protect our air, protect these beautiful places that we thankfully get to enjoy, that are our playgrounds and the places that we spend with our families. And this is something that motivated me. I got involved as a teenager in a nonprofit. We went and created a program we took to elementary school kids all across Hawaii. I wrote a little skit for this program called The Adventures of Water Woman. I was, I think, 16 or 17 at the time. And I was Water Woman. I know. But there is a video, there's proof. I had the blue cape and all, but the cool thing was, I was super, super shy as a kid growing up, total introvert. But I really was passionate about this. I was passionate about protecting our planet, and we took this program to like 2nd, 3rd, and 4th graders all across the state. And I'd never given a speech, I'd never talked in front of people, but when I came out as Water Woman with my nemesis, Oily Al, he's all scruffy, oily-looking dude, and we went through a day in the life of Oily Al, and every time he was about to do something like change the oil in his car, and he was going to pour it down the storm drain. Water Woman would come in the nick of time and stop him and save the day and tell him, here's why that's a bad idea. And the best thing was seeing the look on these kids' eyes as they're sitting there, their legs crossed on the floor, watching this, seeing things that they could relate to in their everyday lives. Oily Al dumping a bunch of pesticides on his garden, all these different things, throwing his soda can out the car window as he's driving by, things that they could relate to, and seeing that light bulb go off in their eyes and saying, wow, hey, I can tell mom and dad, I can tell auntie and uncle, don't do that. That's a bad thing. And starting to bring about this change in our kids, to make these better choices in our lifestyle and understand there's consequences to the decisions that we make. So for me, this issue is one that started from when I was very young and has continued throughout my time, both serving in the State House, the City Council, and now in Congress. As president, I will lead the charge in ending our dependence on fossil fuels and making this quick and urgent transition towards clean, renewable energy. Ending the subsidies to the tune of almost $30 billion every year that we are giving to big oil, and redirecting our taxpayer dollars instead towards those investments in infrastructure and clean, renewable energy, ushering in a new green century for us, for all of us. That has to do with clean energy, that has to do with sustainable infrastructure, that has to do with good paying jobs and a trained workforce to work in this industry. This is something that not only makes sense for our environment, but it makes sense economically. The cost of clean energy is now dropping lower than fossil fuels. So even if you're not buying into why we need to protect our environment, think about your pocketbook. We'll save some money in the process. This alone is not enough. We've got to look at agriculture and how so much of the big multinational agriculture corporations and their way of farming has continued to emit more carbon into our environment. We need to provide the incentives to be able to help transition off of this old way of farming and towards sustainable regenerative agriculture that can do so much to help keep our water clean and that can capture so much of this carbon that's already in the environment. There's so much information out there about how we can continue to support our farmers and our family farms and those who are growing food for people to eat by making sure we're doing it in a sustainable way that actually protects our farm, protects our soil quality, and makes sure that we can continue farming these lands for generations to come. Even if we do all of these things now, it still won't be enough to address the global challenge that we're facing, which is why it's so important. Once again, I think many of you have heard me say foreign policy is central to every other issue that we face. I will lead with a foreign policy that's based on cooperation rather than conflict. Working with other countries. Yes, we have our differences with some. We've got to be able to work out those differences using diplomacy while leaving the doors open to be able to work together with them on areas of shared interest, like climate change. China is a lot in the news these days, and Trump is waging this very erratic, emotional shoot-from-the-hip trade and tariff war with China that's taking an economic toll on our farmers, small business owners, manufacturers here, the uncertainty and the destabilizing effect it's having on our economy here, and waging this economic war with a nuclear-armed country, a very dangerous thing. But also the way that he's doing this is not only hurting us here, he's closed off any possibility to be able to work with China on things like climate change, something that's necessary for us to be able to address the global challenge that we face. It has to be done through a global coalition. So yes, I will re-enter the Paris Accords, but you know as well as I do, that doesn't even come close to where we need to be on this planet to protect our planet for you and all of those who will come after you. Now, there's a whole host of other issues that I know we want to discuss tonight, things like immigration reform, gun safety legislation, the need to invest in education and make sure that we're giving our teachers what they need to best take care of our kids, need to invest in infrastructure, the need to continue to fight for and support our working men and women and unions in this country. But I want to be able to save some of that for our discussion and point to the issue that is central to our ability to be able to invest in serving the needs of our people. And that issue is the cost of war. What does that mean? The cost of war. Brian mentioned in his introduction, I continue to serve in the Army National Guard. I'm currently a major. and have served now for over 16 years, deployed twice to the Middle East, where I saw firsthand the high and very terrible human cost of war. I served in 2005, all of 2005 in Iraq in a field medical unit, where every single day we were confronted with those who paid the price. Friends of ours who never came home, whose families got to welcome them home in a coffin. We saw the heavy toll that it took on the people in Iraq. But coming back here at home, where too often the cost of war is symbolized by a name that you'll see on the headlines when yet another one of our men and women in uniform is killed in combat. The cost of war extends far beyond that. Where every single time that, you're told that there's just not enough money to pay for health care for all, that there's just not enough money to make sure there's clean water for our people to drink or bathe in. There's just not enough money to upgrade and improve our infrastructure to make sure it's safe for people. There's not enough money to invest in our children and their classrooms and their education. There's just not enough money. But as every time you are told this by politicians, they are very often the same politicians who don't think twice about continuing to wage these wasteful, counterproductive wars, spending trillions of our taxpayer dollars in doing so. This cost of war is paid for by every one of us. Every single one of us. As president, I will end these wasteful wars. And I will make sure that we don't start any new ones. I will work to end this new Cold War and arms race that we are in. The ever-escalating tensions between the United States and China and Russia, nuclear-armed countries, an arms race that's continuing to take more money out of our pockets and out of our communities to pay for building these weapons that are making us and the world less safe. I will redirect those resources towards nation building right here at home, towards serving the needs of our people, towards rebuilding our future. We've got to get our priorities straight. I want to close on this because it's something that's happening right here, right now. What we're talking about with the cost of war is not just something that happened before. This wasn't something that was just about George Bush's war. This is something that's continuing. It has continued through both political parties, and it's happening right now as we speak. Yesterday, President Trump, through his Secretary of Defense, announced that he was sending more U.S. troops to where? Saudi Arabia. To protect Americans? No. To protect Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia's oil, and Saudi Arabia's infrastructure. Further escalating, what we're already seeing is this mutual cycle of retaliation. And this thing that happened there in Saudi Arabia, it didn't just happen out of nowhere. If you watch the news, they'll say, oh my gosh, Iran provoked, it's continuing to provoke increasing these tensions, this act of provocation. But what happened before that? And I don't look, Iran, I don't justify what they do or anything that they've done. But let's just look at this clear-eyed. This is happening because our sanctions and global sanctions and Trump's tearing up of the Iran nuclear deal and implementing more and more crippling sanctions have stopped Iran from being able to sell any of their oil on the market. Hurting their economy, hurting their people. I mean, did you really think there was going to be no consequence to that? And so now Trump is deploying our troops to serve Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia's interests. The very same country that supports Al-Qaeda today in countries like Yemen and Syria. The very same country that continues to spend billions of dollars every year spreading this extremist Wahhabi ideology around the world that fuels terrorist organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. This is a total betrayal. So the next question is, okay, Tulsi, what would you do? Here's exactly what I would do if I were president today. I would end our alliance with Saudi Arabia. I would re-enter the Iran nuclear agreement, end these crippling sanctions, understanding that every single day that goes by, that this doesn't happen, that this agreement remains in the trash can, is another day that Iran is closer to developing a nuclear weapon. There are very real stakes. The most important responsibility that the president has is to serve you as your commander-in-chief. Our objective must be to keep the American people safe, to ensure our national security. The decisions that this president is making is undermining our national security, and he is dishonoring my brothers and sisters in uniform by sending them on missions that do not serve the interests of the American people, that are serving the interests of a foreign power, essentially giving up our sovereignty to Saudi Arabia, all while taking action that is unconstitutional. And when pressed on how can they take this action without congressional approval, they say, well, the president has Article 2 powers, that our national security is at peril. But I have yet to see what the explanation is. The fact is, the actions they're taking are further placing us at peril. They're further weakening and undermining our national security. Bringing the experience that I have, I am prepared to walk in on day one in the Oval Office and serve you as commander-in-chief, making sure that the decisions that we make in this country actually further strengthen our security and serve the interests of the American people, that we end these wasteful wars, that we de-escalate these tensions with other countries, that we stop being the world's police and engage with other countries in the world with respect, with cooperation, rather than conflict, actually being the force for good that we, the American people in the United States, can and should be in the world. So as you know, we cannot do this alone. The powers that be are powerful. The obstacles are great, but there is no greater power than when we, the American people, exercise our voices and take that power within our own hands to bring about this change within our own government so that it truly is a government that serves our interests. We have a lot of work to do ahead of us. People power is strong, and I'm proud of the people-powered campaign that we have, but I want to invite every single one of you here to join us. I'll have somebody come up here and talk a little bit later on exactly how best you can do that, but I need every single one of you. We cannot underestimate the consequences of continuing the status quo. We can't wait any longer. With that, I'll open it up. Questions, comments, thoughts? Thank you so much.
Representative, is that on? Okay. Representative, I really appreciate your words. I have the great opportunity to work with some of the kindest, open-minded, intelligent people. I English tutor for Iranians who are in Iran, and they tell me, I have one lady that tells me that her grandmother, two grandmothers, one needs to have cancer surgery. It is so expensive since the sanctions that she is not willing to do that to put her family at risk. Her other grandmother cannot get the cardiovascular medicine that she needs When I heard this, and they didn't just volunteer to tell me this, I heard this over months. I was heartbroken because we talk about healthcare in our country, and we talk about it a lot, and we should. What I want to know, you outlined your position, and I have another gentleman who works in the clinic, and he tells me a lot about people who are not getting their medicine. They won't take their medicine because it's too expensive. My question is, why aren't these stories, because really we're at war right now with Iran, with these sanctions. We are, it's a siege, and these people are literally dying. And the other question I want to ask is this. If we, God forbid, have people, soldiers on the ground, will you continue to advocate for a peaceful resolution to the situation that benefits our people and the Iranian people? Thank you.
Of course. But we've got to prevent us from getting to that point. We've got to prevent us from getting to that point. I want to talk a little bit, I want to comment a little bit about your point about sanctions. I mean, sanctions are, when you look at regime change wars of the past, it is these sanctions, which are really a modern day siege, that are the first phase of that regime change war. And if you look at the traditional, what was the old school definition of a siege, right? It was these blockades where you're blocking food and water and medicine and supplies from getting to a people or a territory or an area that you're seeking to conquer in some way, that you're going to try to squeeze them until maybe the people turn against their leader, or it is defeat through attrition. And if you look at these crippling sanctions like the ones that we have against Iran now, it is a modern day siege. And it is not the government who suffers. And if you look throughout history, with these sieges and blockades of the past, it's never those in power who end up suffering as a result of this, because they've got their ways, right? They've got their food stores, and they've got their, ways to exploit the black market. It is always the people who suffer the most as a result of this. And so you're absolutely correct that this war has already begun, which is why it's so important that we stop it. Because otherwise, if you see this cycle of retaliation, this constant tit for tat, well, they did this, now we've got to respond to that, then they've got to respond to that, and then we've got to respond to that, where does it ever end? I'll tell you where it ends. It ends with an all-out inferno of a war across not just Iran, but across the region. And you see how dangerous and how costly this would be. Iran has a far stronger military. It's a much bigger country than anything we ever saw in Iraq. This would not be contained within Iran. This is something that would spread across the region. So we know that the cost and the consequence in American lives, in the lives of people across the region, and in American taxpayer dollars would make what we lost and wasted in the war in Iraq minuscule in comparison. It looked like a picnic in comparison to what we would see here, which is why it's so important that we not allow it to get to that point. I introduced legislation called the No More Presidential Wars Act. This is the second Congress that I've introduced this legislation. And very simply, it says that if the president, any president, launches a war without the authorization of Congress, that is an impeachable offense.
Okay, so something near and dear to my heart and my generation's heart and pretty much every generation after me is climate change. Yes. And so I'm wondering if you have anything in place or what for stopping the continued development of the Amazon, because as most people know, that's the lungs of the world. And it's one of the things that terrifies me the most right now, because obviously if that continues, we're not going to have a planet to protect. We're not going to have any need for government.
Thank you. How many of you here were watching those terrible, terrible fires and devastation in the Amazon, something that was extremely heartbreaking to watch and to see the native people there and the animals just being forced to flee because of these fires. I think there's a couple of things that, at a very practical level, we've got to look at, right? I mean, we saw a lot of attention and international pressure and pressure from the media and focus being put on the government in Brazil. But this isn't just happening in Brazil, it's happening in a lot of other places as well. But how they were in some ways, because of that attention, forced to begin to respond, right? To deal with these fires and to try to put them out. But my concern with this, which I think I share with you, is that, well, this is not in the news anymore, but the problem hasn't been solved. That the Amazon is still being destroyed. It's still being overdeveloped. Trees are still being cut down. And I think what came through as these fires were in the news was how much of this is happening to further the meat industry. Brazil, I believe, is the #1 exporter of beef in the world. And so much of this land is being cleared either for cattle or to grow food to feed the cattle. So if they're the #1 exporter of beef in the world, they are providing the supply for a demand. What can we do? We can reduce the demand. It's a tough choice for some to make, but if we care about our planet, and if we care about the kinds of changes we are seeing in our environment and to our climate, it is these kinds of decisions that we can make personally, and that enough people in the world need to make in order to stall those changes and to be able to protect the lungs of our planet. Just bring a microphone for you.
I have 2 questions and a request.
Yes, sir. Just speak right into it, right into the top. There you go.
2 questions and 1 request.
Yes, sir.
How is the Iowa Democratic Party treating you?
Okay. Well, what's your? Yeah, do all 3, and I'll answer them all.
All right. Secondly, would you tell the anecdote about your experience in Hawaii when you got the missile warning?
Sure.
And I forgot the 3rd one.
Okay. Well, let me know if you remember. I'm really grateful because as we've gone through different counties across the state, the county chairs and other folks at the local Democratic Party here in Iowa have been very helpful in getting the word out about events that we're having like this and connecting us with people and coming and also helping facilitate the conversation. Hope that answers your question. Okay. Yeah, I would say so. Yes. You know, it's just something interesting that I've been finding over the last few weeks is there's a disconnect, no surprise, between Washington and the DNC there and your local Democratic Party. It's understandable that people here and even people within the Iowa Democratic Party don't take kindly to being dictated to and told from Washington what they should or shouldn't do, or limiting the candidates who you as voters should be exposed to and allowed to vote for. So I think it's a good thing that we're seeing more and more people, voters, and especially here across Iowa, just saying, look, we're the ones who get to make the decision about who our Democratic nominee will be, not anybody from Washington and nobody else certainly outside of your state. So I think that's an important thing for us to remember, where the power really lies. You want me to talk about the experience that we had in Hawaii last year when we had a serious wake-up call to the nuclear threat that exists, not just for us in Hawaii, but for our whole country. It was actually a Saturday morning. Today's Saturday. It was a Saturday morning in January when a civil defense alert went out across over 1 million cell phones across the state, started blasting on radios and on TV shows saying missile inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. Imagine if we all got that message right here. If our phones started buzzing right here as we're sitting here. Missile incoming, seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. What are some of the first things you would think? Where the hell is the shelter? Exactly. Seek immediate shelter. Really? I mean, is this a shelter that'll protect you from a nuclear attack? Yeah, exactly. It might be from the 50s. Those ones that had the little triangle shape on it that, you know, like you go beneath the desk and you just pray and pray and pray. This is the joke, though. This is the joke, right? Let's say you go to that shelter. Are you really gonna think that shelter is gonna protect your loved ones if that attack comes? And then what is the point? And then what is the point? So this is what was running through everyone's minds in Hawaii. It was absolutely terrifying. We had college kids sprinting across campus. They showed the CCTV footage afterward, sprinting across campus looking, where do I go for shelter? We had a father who lowered his little girl down a manhole, thinking that that might be the only place she would be safe. Friend of mine, he has like 7 kids. He piled his whole family in the car and they went driving to the mountains. They were looking for a cave, thinking like, hey, maybe, just maybe we might be safe there. But the reality is there was no shelter to be found. And that is the big hoax. That is the big lie, is that we are in a situation today where we, all of us, are at a greater risk of nuclear catastrophe, nuclear attack now than we ever have been before. This is, nuclear strategists have written about this over and over again. And it's because of these escalating tensions. It's because of this new Cold War that we're in. It's because of this arms race that's continuing to grow that we're in this situation. And so we have these fancy alert systems that tell us, okay, missile incoming, seek shelter, but there is no shelter. These same leaders who have created this situation, they have not spent the trillions of dollars that would be required for every community in this country to have very deep underground bunkers where we could all go, that we would find within 15 minutes of anywhere that we were, with enough food and water and the ability to grow food and capture water to sustain us for all of the nuclear fallout and the nuclear winter that comes from a nuclear attack. That doesn't exist. Now, there may be something like that for what we in Hawaii call the high muckety mucks in government. Those may exist, but they don't exist for us. So this is where we are today. This is the reality and the wake-up call that we got last year. The most important thing that I hope you take away from this tonight is that it does not have to be this way. It does not have to be this way. So when we talk about the greatest threat that we face, I often speak about this threat of nuclear catastrophe because it is an existential threat. People forget that the United States and Russia, we still have hundreds of missiles, if not thousands, pointed at each other on hair trigger alert. On hair trigger alert. And there have been a lot of close calls where somebody made a mistake and said, oh my gosh, I think there's a missile attack coming in, but it turns out it was the shadow of a satellite being launched into space. So many near misses. And then recently you have people in the Pentagon saying, well, we think that we should give the power to decide whether or not to respond to a nuclear attack to robots. That we should automate this and take it out of the hands of humans. I agree. I agree. But this speaks to where we are, and this speaks to the need for strong leadership to change. Strong leadership that has the courage to meet with both adversaries and friends in order to de-escalate these tensions and walk us away from the brink of nuclear catastrophe. This is why within the first week of being president, I will call for a summit between the United States and Russia and China to begin this process of working together. footsteps, inspired by the examples of great leaders who have come before, who recognize that this is not just a threat to the American people, it's a threat to our existence in this world. That you don't just launch a nuclear weapon that takes out a few hundred people. That this is something that would destroy our planet. Leaders like JFK, who met with Khrushchev to prevent a nuclear war. The agreement that Reagan made with Gorbachev, the INF Treaty that Trump recently tore up and threw in the trash can. Following in those kinds of examples to make these deals that many consider to be impossible, but deals that are necessary to ensure that we have a future on this planet.
I stepped in a few minutes late, so I don't know if I missed anything about gun control, but I think I just heard you say you'd like to push that off until later.
No.
However, if I could crack that open right now, I'd love to.
Absolutely.
If I might, I don't really so much have a question because I think I know the answer. Everybody here is probably in agreement. Guns are bad. Assault weapons are bad. I don't think you can beat extremism with extremist rhetoric. I don't think like the Beddoes, we're taking your guns away message is going to get the fringe voters we need. I think we need a message with more specific targets. And yes, universal background checks are a great place to start, but they're going to be ineffective in their current form still.
Yeah.
Mental illness is the claim everybody says that, well, HIPAA laws prevent, psychological doctors from revealing the medical records of their patients. That information doesn't become available during a background check. There are a lot of people that slip through the cracks in background checks. More specifically than that even, what we really want to prevent are the extreme crazy things like Las Vegas. That guy lived 60 years of his life and never owned an assault rifle. And then he went on a spending spree. Over the next year and a half, he bought 50 or more of them. Most of those purchases were made at gun stores, where they do record the sale of that gun. But there have been laws written which specifically prevent the ATF from accessing, funny term, they actually, in 1986, they called it computer records, but electronic records. And throughout the years, in virtually every spending bill that's been passed until 2011, when they finally made it officially a law, the ATF is prevented by law from consolidating records. So the Las Vegas shooter with his 50 assault rifle purchases, and I know, that's I guess where my point is I want to hear a message from you or any of the other candidates that has precise, instead of just the guns are bad, insightful words like ban and we're going to take your guns away, things like that I think are going to lose the small margin of voters that we need to win. And these gun laws, another one of the defenses that whenever you start talking about gun laws, well, they always say, how can we enforce new gun laws when the ones that we have don't work?
Yeah.
Well, instead of saying new laws, just say, let's fix the ones we have. This ban on the electronic record database is ridiculous. It's just kind of a no-brainer, and that needs to be a targeted area in the gun control talk.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
that was
Do you wanna
kind of my
comment on
question.
this? Do you want to comment on this? Related to this? Okay. Well, let me deal with this, and then we'll move on to another question. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and insights on this. And I think what's at the heart of what you're talking about is that we need to have real conversations about how we bring about the kind of real sensible reforms that we need to see to solve the challenges and the epidemics and the murders that we're seeing happening too often in all parts of our country that are creating this fear that, and grade school kids coming to our town halls saying that they're having nightmares about being shot up in their school. Parents who are afraid that, when they drop their kid off at school, that may be their last goodbye. And now, I mean, these attacks are happening in places of worship, gas stations, Walmarts, there's no place left, right? You're bringing up, I think, some very important issues. And I want to tell you a little bit about the process that we have in Hawaii that I think makes a lot of sense. Before you can even go in and purchase a gun from a gun store, you've got to go through a safety training session. A safety training session, and you get the certificate. I think it was like 2 days, like a weekend, 2 days, and then you go and you take that certificate in to the store. They see it, and they say, okay, you can buy a gun, but before you're allowed to take that gun home, you've got to go to the police station, and you've got to bring in your training certificate, you've got to fill out a form, you've got to include the name of your primary care physician, and give your fingerprints. They run the background check, and they call your physician to see if there are any mental health concerns that would prevent somebody from being able to own a gun. And they do this over a 2-week period. You come back in 2 weeks, everything checks out, they give you the paper, you go back to the gun store, they check everything out. If everything checks out, you fill out the other government forms there, and then you bring your gun back to the police department before you get your license, and they actually they take the ballistics on that gun, and they keep it on file. So if that gun is used, they'll be able to match it to the ballistics that they have on file. And then you get the license. It's a pretty, so, it could take 2 or 3 weeks. But I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it. I think that the situation that you're talking about with the law prohibiting automation of these records, therefore prohibiting true universal background checks, is an obvious one, I think, that needs to change. Right. Right, exactly. But if the ATF isn't able to access that information, it prevents that from happening. They literally would have to go into that local gun store and actually flip through the files physically. Yeah, yeah. Exactly. So I think just to wrap this up, and this is a bigger conversation, and so I'm looking at some of the different models that we have in different states to say, okay, every state does have a different process that they go through, but I think there should be a baseline level of federal regulations that apply to all states that don't impede on a person's Second Amendment rights, but make sure that there are sensible restrictions in place to keep these guns out of the hands of those who would seek to do harm to others. This is not an issue that has to be a black and white, you either love guns or you hate guns. You either want no guns around or you want absolutely no restrictions. Those are two false choices that I think the vast majority of the American people agree is not really what we're looking at. What we're looking at is maintaining and upholding the Second Amendment while also having sensible safety regulations in place.
This is the last question.
What's your name?
I just wanted to talk about Riken Lopez.
Nice to meet you.
And so I wanted to talk about high schoolers dropping out of school, and people don't have that they have that right to, but that's just the downright way to go to prison. So we need to put more money into education and all that, and so instead of just putting more money into jails for people who just go up, and then the people that's staying in high school and going into college are succeeding and going up higher and probably becoming something these days. But while people go down to prison and they're just gonna live their life down there. So why don't we just put more money into education?
Why don't we just put more money into education? You are exactly right. You are exactly right. So when I talked about our foreign policy being at the center of all these other challenges we face, when politicians say, well, you know what, there's just not enough money for more education. There's not enough money to make sure that every one of our kids is getting the quality education they need to do what they want to do with their lives, to be successful, to pursue their dreams. They just say, well, there's no money. The money's gone. But where has it gone? Where has it gone? Addressing this cost of war and redirecting these resources, these dollars that have been for too long wasted on these wars, and using them to serve our kids and our people is exactly what I will do as president. I want to expand a little bit on your point, where kids are dropping out of high school. I think there are other challenges here that we've got to look at. Why is that? Why is that? Is it because we have overcrowded classrooms and they're not really feeling like they're getting the best use of their time? I think that's a big part of it. Is it because there's this huge pressure on all of our kids that in order to be successful in life, you have to go to college and get a bachelor's degree and a master's degree? For some, maybe. For some, maybe they're just looking to be farmers. Maybe they're looking to be steel workers or electricians. Maybe they're looking at a different vocation. Maybe they want to be a chef. There are all these different options and opportunities that I think are too often not offered to students and encouraged because of this new measure in our society that you must have this piece of paper that may or may not have anything to do with what you want to do with your life in order to be seen as successful. And oh, by the way, you're going to get $30,000, $50,000, $75,000 in debt just to do it. It's crazy. We've got to look more at how we can best first listen to our kids, listen about what their hopes and dreams are, what are they passionate about, and see how we can best provide the tools that they will need to be able to succeed. And there's a lot of things that we can do within our education system to do that. I've seen in some of our high schools in Hawaii how already as sophomores and juniors, they're empowering those who've got a knack for small business, where they're farming or they've got beehives in the back of the school, they've got honey and they're baking and they're selling stuff and they're keeping their own books and they're earning their money, and that money is going back into the school, and they're actually graduating with certificates, with college credits, and they're already well on their way towards pursuing what they believe that they'll be good at and the things that they want to do after school. I think if you show that value in our education to our students, then they'll do nothing but thrive and move forward and up, as you say. Thank you. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I think we've got to wrap up the questions there. I'm going to stick around for a little bit. I'd love to just say hi to those of you who want to come up and say hi and take a quick photo. Are you gonna say? Amory is going to wrap this night up, and he's going to give everyone their marching orders.
Right. Thank you, Tulsi. So if you like what you heard tonight, we need your help. There's some sign-up sheets in the back that you can go sign up for a yard sign, go sign up to volunteer. Whatever you can give to this campaign, we will take. We need all that support so that we can make it into those October debates. And thank you all so much for being here. We are going to line up for pictures over here by AJ. So if you're interested in that, please go on over there, and thank you so much for everyone coming out tonight.
Thank you. Thanks again to Brian and Courtney for having us. Thank you to Steve, the greatest audio guy in all of Iowa. And thank you all so much for coming. Hey, Steve, Joe asked me to tell you that earlier today.
After page, after page,
Oh, you're so sweet.
it gets stranger day by day.
Oh, I would love that. I would love that.
I'll get him to you.
Amory would be the best guy to talk to.
Okay, yeah.
And
You can write a comment, and you can
past with our foreign policy and intervening in their governments and their policies. Looking forward, instead of spending all this money, almost $750 a day per person to keep them maintained at our borders, take some of that money and I would take two approaches. Look at microloans and how we can try and direct aid to people to be better empowered and
You walk into the world you make. You lose yourself, but you find your way. I'm gonna watch you radiate, 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 radiate. We turn so slow, I know it's hard to wait. But take your time, son, it's yours to take. I'm gonna watch you radiate, 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 oh, oh, radiate. These rocks, they hold heat, pools of water cool your feet. As you walk, you believe every part of the dream. I see you lost in what you create. All of time in this one single day. You take it and you radiate, 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 oh, oh, radiate. Follow your hands as they build, as they shape, as they follow your mind. And rolls like a wave, take it and you radiate, radiate. Gonna watch you radiate, oh, oh, radiate. Well, these rocks, they hold heat, pools of water cool your feet. As you walk, you believe every part of the dream.
Yeah.
and having that people respecting them as equal because of that.
That's true.
I'm hurrying it up. So just things.
I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you.
In your head.
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll take our
Thank
picture.
you.
I love it. 1, 2, 3.
There's a black
Thank you.
hole
I was looking for you as I was up
and
here.
I slowly bend till I see the back of my own sins. I stole my soul from myself. Now I wonder.
Oh, good. I'm a teacher, and I really like what you said about education.
Wonders there's somebody with a perfect plan that goes boom when it's stamped, and we could understand how the gods of old used to clap their hands to make thunder. So we're clapping and we're laughing like it was so absurd. In the future we'll be laughing at who we were right now. This man plays God with the land that he plundered. To the one unknown, no one can know nor see. There's resistant to greed if we listen to time after time. Time can never go under. There's this vine trying to climb through the window into my life. I don't mind, I don't mind, I don't mind. There's this wine trying to find its way from the bottom into my mind. In my mind, in my mind, in my mind.
Even though my amendment failed, because we even had that in there, we were raising attention to it. In the final version of the bill, they took it out.
Okay.
Yeah. But it, you know, it doesn't. This administration doesn't think they need to come to Congress, which is the problem. So we're working on fighting that now. We've got other bills that we've introduced,
So this vine is trying to climb through the window into my life to bring me symmetry and memories of a backlit breeze. Back into a dream on the ground, looking up at the sun coming down. To a world of boys and girls are holding handheld devices while they're eating and they're sleeping and they're dreaming of the prices we'll be paying down the line. When the ice melts, maybe it will turn to wine. And all the greatest of the heroes started jumping from the books. They started wearing ones and zeros, looking more and more like crooks. They stole the sunlight from the future, took a sip, drank half the glass and put it back. And a lot of people like to have a feast, not so many can stomach the killing. A lot of traffic on the street, so who's really doing all the drilling? Keep on filling what can never be full. My imagination got a hold. There's this vine trying to climb through the window into my life. I don't mind, I don't mind, I don't mind. There's this wine trying to find its way from the bottom into my mind. In my mind, in my mind, in my mind.
Spread the word. All right. Hi, how are you? What's your name? Anya? That's my mother. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I haven't seen you in a while. I saw you in the back. It's great to see you again. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Dad was one of the first people I met when I first came here. He was talking about
Mama made you sweet. Your daddy gave you daydreams and we're pushing in the seat. Your mama gave you those windows to your beautiful soul. Daddy got more love for you than you could ever know. Oh, oh, you remind me of you.
That's right, school had just started.
Yes, you do. You remind me of you.
Oh, really?
Yes, you do.
It was actually
Badu, badu, badu.